Hey YouTube, Mark Kaufman here, and today, as you can see before you, this is the nail file video that I've been discussing in past videos. Now, some of these knives are in a little, well, actually just one is in disarray here. It doesn't have any scales, but the rest of these are the majority of my collection when it comes to a knife that has a nail file. Now, first off, I want to say I am sorry if I mess up a name or if I get one mixed up with another, because there's a lot of knives in front of me right now, and keeping all their names straight is going to be a little bit difficult. Now, to start us off really quick, I want to make note that I do not have all of the knives that have ever had a nail file on it from either Victorinox or Wenger. The knives that I do not have are usually like a secretary, not even a secretary. I can't even remember the names of the, I think it was called the accountant. And these knives were 74mm knives, and they went back to like the 1940s and 30s. And some of them went into the 1950s. But a lot of these knives are knives that you really cannot find right now, or you have to pay a lot of money. And one thing that I don't like to do is pay a lot of money, along with a lot of us. So I'm going to show you really quick a few photos of the knives that I don't have, and a few knives that I found in my research. And these knives are all very different. They have different styled fingernail files, but the majority of them are actually what they call lobster claw styled knives, or where the nail file comes out on a back spring behind the knife blade or on the other side of the knife. So it's not encapsulated within the same housing that the blades are housed. It's actually in the back. Now, these knives are all very hard to find, and some of them are lost to history. There have been a few very interesting ones that were released, and one of them was a Huntsman that was released in 2000, I think it was 11 or 10, and I found some pictures of it in the catalog and some sale pictures, and I'm going to show you that one here. Should be showing up on the screen. And that is actually a modern Victorinox knife, and I would consider that modern, 2011. And it has that back thin nail file. Now, some of these knives were also called like the Champion, which had that long nail file, but most of these long nail files ceased production in, I believe it was the mid-70s or the end of the 1970s. So without further ado, those are the knives that I do not have on the table, but let's get into these here. Now, I have taken a few photos of some knives that I don't have currently, and I will show those as comparative representations against a few other ones here, but I've also taken close-up photos of some of the fingernail files here so you can get a good representation and be able to see in detail what I'm talking about. So first off, we're going to start with this Bijou. This is a Bijou from the 1960s, and this has the cross-etched file or fingernail file. Now, what's very interesting about this is it has this beautiful scalloped tip on it. Now, this fingernail file was continued on all the way through, I would say, the late 70s. Maybe even because Victorinox did a thing where they would take old stock items like parts and install it into their knives to get rid of them. So sometimes you'd find an older or a newer knife with an old file. So this here is early 60s, but Victorinox would still keep this file all the way into the late to mid 70s, and this is one from the mid 70s. So I don't know why I put that one down, but there is a difference here, and the finishing is a little different, and then also the width is a little bit wider on here, and I'm talking about like 0.5 millimeter. But the back here is also different. They went with a flat back end, and then they had the beautifully scalloped end on the older one. So there is that file. This one is just one that I'm going to be carrying, but I need to get scales for it. Next up is going to be a companion, and this has the classic style nail file, and this is going to be your oh man, I can't even remember what finish. This is a textured finish on this one, and this type of finish was introduced into the mid-70s. So this type of nail file will also be seen on your broker. This is one from the 1980s, and it can also be seen on a Escort. This is one of my favorites. This is an Escort from the early 80s, and it is a silver Alox, but I mean, look how thin that is. So this nail file texture really continued on to modern day until Victorinox switched over to their I think it's horizontal. No, I am just drawing a blank, but diagonal cut type of file. I believe it's diagonal or horizontal. So from there, these files continued on for quite a while. They continued through the 80s, 90s until now. Victorinox still uses this file. So this file had two representations. You had the classic, which had the nail cleaning tool, but then you had the SD finish. And the SD, well, not finish, but nail file had the screwdriver tip and then that textured finish. Moving on to the 74mm knives, we have the Ambassadors and a Windsor. And this is an Ambassador from the 1970s. And this nail file is not perfect. You can see that it's kind of oblong, not completely centered, not completely perfect. And this is a very early representation of these newer nail files and how they're implementing them into their tools. Now this is going to be right here a more modern 1970s nail file, and you can see even still it is not perfectly centered. You can see that it kind of hits too close near the bottom. It's very close to the edges, and it's not until about the 1980s that they really perfected that and had it hit right where they wanted it to be, and it was actually going to be centralized and perfectly equilateral. So you can see it kind of runs too far down here, kind of runs a little too high here, and then over here it's near perfect. So one of the things that's really interesting is they still make that Ambassador model today, but they have discontinued it. But you can see how this is still very uniform, very, it's not imperfect at all. It really is a finalized product there. Now, moving away from those smaller nail files, which is actually the smallest nail file that Victorinox makes, is the one that's on the Ambassador and Windsor. We are now going over to the Prince model, and originally the Princes were called Princesses, and then they were changed over to Prince. And then they kind of switched over from this being a princess to the Escort being a princess, and then they changed it to an Escort. And then you also had the 74mm that had the one blade, and then the nail file was also called an Escort. So you had kind of a switching of names, but these nail files are very interesting. I'm going to go to the very earliest one that I have, and that is this Prince from the 1970s, and this has the cross-cut nail file, but it also has the double-etched back nail file. This nail file was used more like a grinding wheel, where you could cut a lot more material off of your fingernail and then finalize I guess the finishing with this one. Then you also have this really nice nail cleaning tip, and that was actually carried over for a very long time until they discontinued this model. So here is a Prince from the 1980s, and no double-crossed file in the back. They stopped doing this in the late 70s, and they just ended up having the solid back. This one is from the 1980s. Now over here, this one is from the late 1980s, And this is what I would call a imperfect, the imperfect type. And I meant to say perfect for that other file. I think I said imperfect, but forgive me. There's a lot to cover here. So this one here is what I would call an imperfect file because the filing marks are not perfectly straight. You can see on the right one they are perfectly straight and they have nice little squares and cuts. On the left side you can kind of see it's got a squiggly line and it's not really that uniform. This one does not cut as well as a more refined one, and I just think that was a failure in the manufacturing. So then we can move over to the 74mm companion and we can now see this textured finish. Now this here is going to be a finish that is very effective. I find that the crosscut finish is effective, but this is also very effective. But what I like about the crosscut is you reach down to the very edge of the nail file, and this one does not. So we've got a very interesting selection of nail files there. But these are all very different knives. They all have different nail files, different finishings, and then we have here another Prince, and this one is probably from the early 80s, and again, no double cut back. So very interesting to see that change. Next up is going to be your Sportsman. The Sportsman is one of my favorite Victorinox knives, and this is a modern day Sportsman, and this is what Victorinox is using now for their nail files. And I find this to be the most effective. It cuts very aggressively, cuts very well, and it does a really good job. Whereas the original Sportsman nail file was a lot like what you had on a classic or a companion. You had that textured or matte finish nail file. There's nothing really wrong with this. It's just I find the newer one to be a little more effective. So Victorinox has moved over from this to this now, and all the modern nail files are going to be finished like this with this type of hatching here. Excuse me. So moving away from these, we are now going to move over to Wenger. Now, Wenger originally started with this type of nail file, and this is a cross-hatched nail file. This knife is from the 1960s, and we have a beautiful nail file with a beautifully cut nail cleaning end here. Now this nail cleaning end, really they were very ornate with the nail cleaners back in the day, and you can see that with the princes and the princesses, and then you can see that also with this, I believe this is a Commander. So you can really see how they took a lot of pride in the nail cleaner at the end. But Wenger eventually moved away from that type of finish and went to this kind of finish, which is that matte or textured finish. And really that was like a industry standard at that point. In the 1970s, that's what most companies were using, and it was a very effective texture for grinding down your fingernail. But Wenger originally had their nail files going inward. So this is a Galahad from their Dynasty series, but you can see the nail file goes in onto the blade, and that can be said for the original Commander as well. It goes in on the blade, and it wasn't until the late 80s, I'm going to say 88, 89, that Wenger was now switching it around, and they were placing it on the outside, and it wouldn't graze your beautiful blade. So it was really nice to see that they were willing to switch that over and you wouldn't scratch your blade, but Victorinox has not done that yet. I really wish they would. So we have that finish for the Wenger. Now, Wenger never did change out their texture or their finish because they were bought by Victorinox in 2005. Now, moving over to the 74mm Executive. The Executive is probably the most interesting because they have had all three finishes from Victorinox. They have had the crosshatch finish, and then they have had the single hatch finish, but they have also had the very rare and elusive matte or textured finish fingernail. And I have actually found and seen one, and I have photographed it, and it should be showing up here on the screen. And that one I actually suspect falls back into this idea of them testing out this finish and seeing how it would fit on a few of their knives. See, now this one here doesn't fit perfectly, and you can see that in that picture it also did not fit perfectly on the tooling of this nail file. So they ended up going back to this finish because, well, you have this beautiful little inlay cut here, and they ended up just sticking with this. Personally, I find this to be a very effective finish, but the other model was very effective. And then if I could find a modern day one with this single hatch finish, I would be very happy because I find this one to be the most effective. Now, finally, we're going to move over to the metal files. Now, the metal files have had two iterations. The first file was the case hardening steel file. And this was case hardening steel. It was not as robust as the stainless steel that they use for their files now, and that is Victorinox, but this was used as a metal file, but it was not as robust, and you'll see here that I can even bend it here and probably snap it. It's not as robust as the modern files Victorinox makes currently. And these files are also thicker, harder to bend, and they're more robust. They cut more aggressively, and they're more effective at cutting, I would say, plastics, metals, very light metals, probably aluminum, and they're very effective at cutting even wood if you need to. I have used this as a finishing file for sharp edges on metal cases or anything like that, and it does a very good job. However, the older file does not. It's not as robust, the teeth aren't as sharp, and it just doesn't do as an effective job as it could. So this is my Victorinox Swiss Army and Wenger Swiss Army nail file video. I'm sorry this one was so long, and it was really long-winded. I'm very surprised that I was able to get most of the names right, but it took a long time to accumulate a lot of this information, excuse me, and to be able to bring forth all these different models, all these different photos, and all this information into one video. And I have to say it was a great journey. I hope that this video helps you date your knife, kind of understand the nail files and files of Swiss Army knives. And I just really hope you guys find a lot of knowledge in this video. So till the next one, I will talk to you guys later. Bye-bye.